So welcome to the final session of this conference. I hope you're still good in terms of energy. I see some very energetic faces, so that's good. So in this final session, Antonina Levatino and Luis Parcerisa will provide a presentation on the reformed database. As some of you might know, the data of the reform project will soon be made available to external researchers in an open access format. And Antonina and Luis will explain you what data we collected and also what methodology we followed. So as a little background, as Tony was saying in his first presentation, the reformed project consisted of 2 research strands, and it can also be considered a multi-method project. And the first research strand aims to understand how and why SAWA policies are disseminating globally. And to examine this, we relied on both qualitative data through in-depth interviews and a survey, or in-depth interviews and policy document analysis. And then the second research strand focused on the enactment of SAWA policies. And to examine this, we collected both quantitative and qualitative data through a survey and in-depth interviews. So we will start this session with Antonina, as she will present the quantitative data set and the survey that was used to collect the data. And then Luis will continue with the qualitative data that we collected. After their presentation, there's an opportunity to ask questions or in case you have some doubts, and then we will finish the closing ceremony with Agnès Van Zanten. So now I give the floor to Antonina.
I need
We will move the presentation. We will move it up.
One moment. So, good afternoon, everyone. So, as Marjolaine has said, I will present you. Oh, what happened? What happened? Can you?
Yeah, let's put it on first, and then I will.
Yes. So, good afternoon. I will present you the reformed survey, and the content of my presentation will be focused on the questionnaire content, the methodology we follow to collect the data, and then I will. Excuse me. Yes. Okay. And as the survey contains some survey-based experiments, I will give you some example of analysis you can do with this data. Yes? So, why we decided to present you the data? So on the one, we have like 2 reasons why. So the first reason is related to what Marjolaine was said. As you know, the data set will be available for external researchers very soon. So the aim of this presentation is to let you know the content of this database, so the data we collected, what data we collected, and how we collect them. And I will give you also some information on the methodological steps we follow to collect the data, because we think this information is important for you to assess the quality this data can have, because, yes, I think it is a very important information to let you know what methodological step we follow to guarantee the quality, the reliability, and the validity of the data. The second reason why we want to present the survey is because when we started the project and we had to design these big surveys, we realized that survey experience is very less documented. So many people do surveys, but it is very difficult to know what they exactly did, because in conferences we are used to present results, and in published paper we have so little space to explain the methodology that it's very difficult to find examples you can look at when you are designing a survey. So for us it's very important to communicate to you also how we proceed, because we think that some lessons learned or some methodological steps we follow can be of interest of you if you're planning to do a survey in the future, and maybe you can take some ideas of our proceeding. So I will not give you a lot of details about the theoretical underpinnings of the surveys, but I think the 3 main theoretical points were important for us when we started to design the survey. So the first one was that the idea that individual actors mediate policies by giving meaning, interpreting, and translating them into practices in various ways, as theorized by Ball and colleagues. Then we give a lot of importance to the centrality, to the characteristics of the local context where schools operate. And then the context of local education market was very important for us, and we think the local education markets operate as autonomous regulatory forces, and the position occupied by the schools within these markets plays a significant role in influencing actor perceptions, interpretation, and actions. Having this in mind, the survey has two main objectives. From one side, we wanted to provide quantitative large-scale dataset containing relevant contextual and subjective variables related to this interpretation and translation that that I was talking about, and also contextual information about the schools to be analyzed. But also, we had very clear that our approach was a multi-method approach, a mixed method approach. So the survey also served us to obtain relevant information to typify and select school principals and teachers for the qualitative scrutiny. And this is the step of the research that Luis will explain to you afterwards. So the reformed survey was applied in 3 different accountability policy settings. I will be also very brief in this. These are 3 very different policy settings. We have an high-stakes accountability context, which is Chile. Then we have Norway, which is which we define like a thick but reflexive accountability context. And then the case of Catalonia is a low-stake accountability context. The survey is made up by two questionnaires: a principal questionnaire, which was applied to principals and other relevant members of the school leadership team, and the teacher questionnaire. Regarding the sampling, we followed like a 3-step methodology. So as we gave so much importance to local education market, we decided to restrict our research to urban schools. So the first step was to build the sampling frames. This means to make a complete and exhaustive list of all the schools that enter to this definition of urban schools in all 3 cases. Then within the sampling frames, we sampling schools, and then within the selected school, we selected teachers. So regarding the sampling frames, these 3 cases, as you can imagine, are also very different from the criteria of urbanity in the 3 cases is very different, because Norway is a very sparsely dense country where municipalities are huge maybe, but they are very scarcely populated. Chile has another type of context where there are these provinces which are highly densely populated. And this is why when we built the sampling frame, the criteria of urbanity was also like adjust to the specificity of each country. So in Norway, we combined the indicator of population density with that of the size of the municipality and the condition of centrality of the urban settlement areas, according to a classification we found in the Norwegian Statistics Bureau. In Chile, we focus on 3 provinces, in which most of the municipalities are urban context. These are Santiago, Valparaíso, and Concepción. And then we excluded the municipality within these provinces with a density of less than 115 inhabitants per square kilometer. In Catalonia, we combined the classification of large urban areas based on population according to the Ministry of Public Works and Transport with the population density indicator. So once we had these sampling frames, which are this list of the complete list of the schools that follow that are located in locations that have this characteristic for each case, we applied a systematic probability proportional to size sampling. What does it mean? So this means that within the sampling frames, within this list, we choose some extrinsic variables that were made that were used to group schools into strata, and within this strata we sorted schools according to other implicit variables, and then we made the random sampling, and it is proportional to size to the extent to which the number of schools selected is proportional to the size of the stratum where they are located. So for each, as you know, because you do research, sometimes you contact participants and they don't want to participate. So for each sample school, we identified 2 replacement schools, which were in this list that I told you. It was always the preceding and the succeeding school. So that is the most similar school. So these replacement schools were identified for each sample schools, but we decided to guarantee the quality of the data to restrict this use of replacement to a maximum of 20% of the total of the sampling, because if I replace all the schools in the sample at the end, I will not have a randomized sample. I will have a convenient sample. So I will not give too much information about the variables we use in each case, because the sampling strategies and the identification of these stratification variables was adapted to each geographical context based on each case particular specificity, but also on the availability of secondary data, which was a challenge in our project, of course. So, but you can get this information in methodological notes. I will give you then the reference. So after we selected the schools, we did that within each school, we interview at least one member of the leadership team, that usually was the principal. And we made a random sampling of 20 teachers, respecting the following selection criteria. So we didn't want only teachers who teach subject evaluated in the national standardized test, but both. So we selected 10 teachers of subject evaluated by external standardized test, and 10 teachers of subject which are not evaluated by the external standardized test. We only restricted our choice to teachers with more than 10 hours per week working at the classroom, because it was very important for us that the teacher knows really the context of the school. And of course, we excluded teachers being at maternity or paternal leave. The questionnaires have been designed to be completed online by means of a computer, table, or smartphone through the Qualtrics platform. But I have to say that you cannot say that our survey is an online survey, because in almost every case, a team of surveyors personally visited the schools, and this was made to incentivize the participation, so increase participation, to prevent dropouts, as well as to solve technical problems and also clarify respondents' potential doubts. So we opted to don't have paper and pencil, because then you have to do a lot of work to codify and everything. But for us was important our presence in the school. So before to go to the content of the questionnaire, I would like to, as I told you, to share with you the methodological steps we follow to develop the questionnaires. Because our idea, our ambition was to achieve high methodological standards, to guarantee the validity and reliability of data, but also to guarantee as much as possible the cross-national comparability of the data. And that's why it was an intensive work. It was a collective work, and this was not only work made by our team, our small reformed research team, but in all these methodological steps, you will see many experts supported us and assisted us with their expertise and advices. Some of them are here in this room, so we would like to take the occasion to thank them for their support and advices. And yes, we think that this strengthens the quality of our work. So the first step, of course, was the development of the theoretical and analytical framework. In this, we organized, our teamwork was organized in form of weekly meetings around the topic of interest, where we invited an expert to talk about the topic and critically discuss with us the concept. We then split this theoretical and analytical framework into thematic units or modules and formed smaller teams made of 1 to 3 researchers, each focused on one module. The work of these smaller teams was to identify the variables or concepts we aimed at measuring in each module and translate these variables and concepts into questions, sorry. In this step, I would like to share with you what we did, because normally what researchers do is like to transform variable directly, desired concept and variable directly into questions. But we found out that survey methodologies are really critical towards this methodology, especially when it is about complex constructs. And we had a lot of complex constructs in the survey. So we found the work of two survey methodologies, which are named Saris and Gallofer, very interesting in this respect, because they propose to elaborate and to formulate questions for complex construct following a three-step methodology. I will give you a short example. For example, we had to operationalize the construct attitude towards performance-based accountability, which is very complex. So the suggestion made by these two researchers is to split the complex concept into simpler concepts that are constituting it. So in this case, for example, attitude, we after a review of literature and a lot of discussion, we thought that attitude towards performance-based accountability is made up of opinion on the validity of the national standardized test, opinion on the fairness of the test-based accountability, opinion on the usefulness of national standardized test, and belief on the causal effect of test-based accountability. So we identify this dimension that are component the complex context. Once you have these simpler concepts, these two authors called concept by intuition, you made assertions which are like practical and concrete manifestation of these opinions, and from the assertion you can then build questions. So this was a very interesting exercise that helped us to disentangle very complex constructs in some of the cases. So once we had this first draft of the questions, what we did is to submit these questions we have to a software which is named Survey Quality Predictor, SQP. This software is very interesting, and I invited you really, if you want to develop a questionnaire, to use it, because it is a software that has a coding system where you can insert your survey question, and you can also and this is a coding system of several items of the question, several characteristics of the questions, and then it gives you a result about the validity, reliability, the potential validity, reliability of the survey question, and also suggestions to improve on how to improve the questions. Also, the software contain an open access database, which is also very interesting because it contains example of how a concept has been operationalized in many surveys, and how the questions have been translated into different languages. So it can be also used when you are trying to translate from different languages. And this is for free. So I don't know, I have no interest in publicizing this, but it was very useful. So after this first check, we sent the module with this first draft of the questions to experts. And this is also a step that survey methodologies say it is like a first check of quality of a questionnaire. And we received a lot of feedback about the content of the modules. And and this is what we want to thank many participants of this conference for, because they were very useful. The comments were very useful to improve our survey. So then we build the source questionnaires, and we submit these source questionnaires to a quality review by survey design experts of the Research and Expertise Center for Survey Methodology of the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, which is located here in Barcelona. And this check was also an expert check, but it was of a more methodological nature. And this was very helpful for us because there are common pitfalls when one is doing research with concern, for example, the number of category in ordinal scales, or, for example, sometimes we don't realize that we are making leading question or double-barreled question, which are difficult to understand. So they are very used to this kind of errors. So they gave us a lot of feedback in this sense. And it was really crucial, for example, because I didn't realize how difficult can be, for example, to decide really how many points should a scale have, for example. And they have a lot of research about this. And this was very useful for us. So, after we have this, all these expert check have done, the sources questionnaire were in English, but we had a lot of annotation, cross-cultural annotation, annotation about the translation, and our associate partners in the different countries helped us a lot to improve how we could adapt the source questionnaires to each context. And then we proceed to the translation of the source question into the different languages. And in this, we follow a methodology which is named TRAPD, which is the acronym for Translation, Review, Adjudication, Pretesting, and Documentation. So and this is the methodology the European Social Survey is following. So this was inspiring for us. And what we did basically is that we let the source questionnaires translated by 2 independent translators, which were like translating the questionnaires in an independent and parallel ways. Then the 2 translators, when they were finished, they were meeting with an adjudicator. So they could discuss similarities or differences in the translation. So to enhance the quality of the translation. So after all that, we had the questionnaires, and what we did was a pretest. So we did national pretest with potential respondents, both principals and teachers, using cognitive interviewing. This was exactly a mixture of concurrent thinking aloud, verbal probing, complemented by a retrospective interview. So we basically test our survey with qualitative interviews and with the qualitative methodology. So what is this concurrent thinking aloud? So we invited the pretest was always accompanied by a researcher of our team, and we invited the participant, so the person who was pretested, to externally verbalize, so to verbalize all their thoughts and doubts about the questionnaire while they were answering. And we also took note of non-verbal expressions or doubts or of perplexity. And we then, in a retrospective interview, we ask about, we ask about all of this. Verbal probing concerned the fact that we already had some doubts on some questions. So while they were answering, we were also asking questions about what do you think about these questions, because we were not so sure. Or do you think what do you mean with this when you read this question? What are you thinking? And this helped us a lot to improve the questionnaire, and the aim were we had many aims with this, because it was very helpful to understand whether the respondents really all understood the same things across countries, and when they were answering, they were thinking at the common set of themes. It was also useful to understand whether they understand what we wanted that they understood. And also it was really, of course, a technical check of everything, like of the layout, or we checked also for technical mistakes and so on. So about the questionnaire content, which is maybe I don't know if it's the most interesting part for you. So our databases contains a lot of information. I will give you only some example of them. So the questionnaires in the database contains information about school characteristics and context. So we know the type of provider, the school size. We have a proxy of social-economic status, except for Norway. But we are still on them because we want to find out a way to ask for secondary data on that. We have information about the results in national standardized tests, of students' geographical provenance, marketing activities conducted by the school, criteria for students' admission, information on school demand, and school demand trends, about school reputation, and then about practices at school like ability grouping, if the leadership is a type of leadership which is more collaborated or distributed. Then we have information about collegiality issue, autonomy, and decision making. In the teacher questionnaire, we have information about pedagogical and teaching practices. In both questionnaire, we have information about respondents' personal and professional information, about personal status and professional status. And a part of basic democratic information, we have information about years of experience, subject and grade out, contract status. For Chile, we have also information on the salary, educational attainment, unions and association membership, job satisfaction, and for teachers, we have also a question on teacher self-efficacy. And then, of course, we have information on this two domain of school autonomy with accountability policy, interpretation and translation. So we ask questions about opinion and attitude towards performance-based accountability and autonomy, some opinion on the validity, fairness, and usefulness of national standardized tests, about performative pressure, preferences related to autonomy and decision-making, and so on. And then we have also questions on the use of national standardized tests, curriculum narrowing, teaching to the test, instruction received to practice for the test, and so on. And as I said you at the beginning, our survey contains also some survey-based experiments which were designed to explore and analyze the undesired behavioral effects of school autonomy with accountability policy and also teacher work motivation. Before going, I would like to give you some example of analysis we can do with these experiments, because I think it's the more maybe novel part of the survey. But before, I would really briefly tell you how does an experiment work. So in an experiment, as you know, an intervention or treatment or stimulus is varied across groups. Subjects are randomly assigned to a treatment group versus a control group. And outcomes are then measured, and as the groups are assigned randomly, and they can be considered equal, the variation in the means can be attributed to the stimulus received. Why we introduce survey-based experiments in the survey? Because, as I say, because of the random assignment, any variation in outcomes can be attributed to the treatment, and this allows to make causal claims on the treatment. Also, we wanted to explore undesired effects of the policies, undesired behavior, opportunistic behaviors, or, for example, things like teacher motivation that can be subject to social desirability bias. And experiments can handle with this with sensitive topics and reduce social desirability. So the survey experiment we have in the questionnaire are basically three. We have a vignette experiment inserted in the teacher survey that we used and that we designed to analyze the differential effects of different consequences, individual, collective, reputational, or material, on the likelihood to cheat, when cheating is a behavior that prevents low-performing students to take the tests, basically, to obtain better results in the national standardized test. And we also designed this experiment also to test whether this issue is really subject to social desirability bias that could influence responses to direct questions, because we saw that existing research is addressing undesired behavior, but by asking respondents directly about their behavior. So maybe they can lie or they can, yeah. So I will show you, for example, this graph. I told you that this is a vignette where the protagonist of the vignette has been advised to cheat to obtain better results in the national standardized test. The treatment is the type of consequence. We have no consequence and consequence of different types. And then we ask the respondent, how likely do you think that the vignette protagonist will do what the friend is advising? And after that, we ask, if you were in the same situation, how likely it would be that you would perform this behavior? And as you see, this is only like really a descriptive figure of the results, and which show clearly that when you ask about the vignette protagonists, behavior. The category, like the responses are like really distributed around all the categories. You see the median is 4, the mean is 3.58, and there are really like, in all the categories there are responses. But when you ask respondent directly and you say, how likely would it be that you would do this, there is a clear polarization in the no-reroll category. So this is something that we did like to really see whether social desirability can be a state. What we also have done is to see the differential effect of the different consequences in the likelihood to cheat. And this is something that we will soon publish in a journal. So, but yes. And this is something that was very interesting because, for example, these are data for Chile, and we found, for example, that Chile is an high accountability state context, but we found that reputational consequences were more important, or equally important, or even more important than material consequences. So what we did then is, after this experiment were performed, and we analyzed the data, and we found this interesting finding, we could triangulate these results with qualitative information coming from the interview to understand why reputation matters so much in an IS accountability context. So this is the reason why we combine quantitative and qualitative. And this is an example of our research. So a part of the vignette, we have 2 conjoint experiments. One is inserted in the principal survey to analyze principal preferred strategies to obtain better national test results. And in these strategies, there are different kind of strategies, and one of them is cream skimming, for example. And we will also analyze this data. And yes, but if you have more, I don't know, I'm explaining this, and I say what we are using this data for, but this data will be open, so you can also like conduct your analysis afterwards. And then we have the third conjoint experiment, which is inserted in the teacher survey, which is aimed to explore teacher preferences for different working scenarios with characteristics related to different work motives. So in this case, what we wanted to know was to what extent contextual factors might explain teacher motivation, and if teachers working in different contexts systematically differ in the importance they give to different work motives. And we thought that it was very challenging. We wanted to address this question, but it was very challenging, according to us, because sometimes different working motives often coexist, and it is difficult to assess what is more important for teachers. And when you ask people directly, how important is this? How important is this other things? And how important is this other? They usually tend to say that everything is important. So it is very difficult to disentangle what is really the weight of something, of some motivation over another. We also think that working circumstances may be crucial in explaining work motivation, but at the same time, however, individuals might self-select in determined working conditions or working circumstances, so endogeneity may be at stake, and this is difficult to compare different contexts. And also, as I told you before, self-reporting on homework motivation might reflect desirable professional ideologies rather than true motivational patterns. So we found many studies that directly asked teachers about their motivation, and we found that prosocial commitment or enjoyability of the experience were always like the most important, while like external rewards were always at the last positions. This, of course, can be a true motivational patterns, but we don't know, because it can be also like correspond to the good teacher imaginary, which is more intrinsically motivated. So it can also be subjected to social desirability bias. So this is difficult for one teacher to admit, I was motivated by a financial reward or an external reward. That's why we decided to approach these research questions with an experiment. And in our research, in this experiment, what we did was to present respondents with 2 alternative school contexts with different characteristics, and respondents are asked to choose between one of them, and the characteristics of the context are randomized. So by analyzing, and then we ask which of the 2 school contexts is more motivating for you, or would you be more like happy to work in? And by analyzing whether an option is selected or not, we can assess the role of each feature in increasing or decreasing the likelihood of each option to be chosen. So that's, yes, it's a, and I will show you some results. So in this is only slides where I wanted to show you very, very quickly the characteristics that change randomly. And you see, if the two school scenario are presented one by one, like they are presented in the board screen, when teachers have to select which working scenario is the preferred one, they have to make a choice, because they are forced to make a choice. So in this point, they focus their attention to one dimension or to some dimension which is more crucial for them. And this trade-off, ponderation, can give us the weight each motives or each characteristic has in the choice. So these are very preliminary results on the analysis of the conjoint in the 3 countries. And I will give you only some insights for those of you who are not familiar with this kind of figure to read the figure. So the points that you see are the point estimates. The line are the confidence interval, 95% confidence interval. And what you have to see if the line overlap with the middle line, this is a non-significant result. And when the lines are overlapping between them, this means that there is no significant difference between them. And when a point is on the right side of the figure, this means that the feature is increasing the likelihood of an option to be chosen. While when the point is on the left part of the figure, this means that this feature, this particular characteristic, is discouraging teachers to choose an option. And we found that this results very stimulating, and we are now in the process of thinking about the similarities and differences identified. For example, from this graph we can see that there are features that are similar across countries. So teachers' prefer to work in mixed ability or mixed classrooms. They prefer to be evaluated by classroom observation. And what we found very interesting is to see also how they clearly dislike in external standardized tests as a tool of evaluation. What is also interesting, we find this interesting because we are comparing very different contexts. And in Chile, for example, standardized tests are more sedimented, they have a longer trajectory, but even though there is this consensus that external standardized tests are not liked by teachers. But more interesting than similarities, we found, for example, the differences between teachers in the 3 cases. For example, regarding the external rewards, we found that in Norway and Catalonia, teachers especially dislike individual teacher salary bonuses. But in Chile, the situation is the opposite. We have that they prefer the salary bonus for individual teachers is the most preferred feature. So we were in this moment, we are wondering what can be the mechanism behind these differences. And for example, one hypothesis we have is connected with teacher condition of teachers in Chile, because for example, in Norway and Catalonia, TALIS data of 2018 show that Norwegian and Catalan teachers have a salary that is above the OECD average, while and they are also satisfied with their salary above the OECD average, while this is not the case in the Chilean case. So maybe Chilean teachers, by stating this, they are not saying that individual salary bonus is a trigger for their motivation, but they see it like a way to complement an unfair salary. Another hypothesis we have is connected with collegiality, because if you know the Norwegian and Catalan cases, you can see that Norwegian collegiality is very important, and you can see, for example, support from colleagues is very important in Norway, and is important in Norway, is the preferred option, and in Catalonia is a context where the relationship in schools are very horizontal. So maybe this is also this can explain also these differences, because maybe in country where collegiality is so important, an individual salary bonus is seen as a threat to relationship between colleagues. So I will stop here. So to sum up, So the reformed survey delivers a large-scale dataset that can be used to explore and analyze the enactment of accountability policies in different contexts by taking into account information regarding the local education market where the sample schools are located, as well as school level and individual level relevant variables. The conception and development of the reformed questionnaires, as well as the sampling strategy, have involved a number of steps aiming at attaining a good level of data comparability across cases and at obtaining high-quality data. And the survey, as I say, includes survey experiments allowing to explore and analyze social sensitive topics and examine in a more accurate way the isolated causal effect of some policy features on behaviors and preferences. So the data will be soon accessible. If you want to know more information on the questionnaire designs, we have two methodological notes. One is already published, and this is on the survey methodology and content, and the other one is on the sampling strategy and coverage of the data, which has been written by my colleague Gerard Ferrer-Esteban, and which is forthcoming. You will find the reformed methodological papers in our webpage. Yes, so if you have doubts, you can consult them or directly contact us. Thank you.
Okay. Well, my colleagues just told me that I only have 10 minutes. So, because then we have the concluding ceremony with Agnès Van Zanten, so I will do my best to be brief. Okay. Well, now I'm going to present very briefly the qualitative methodological note of the second research strand. As shown during the conference, the reform project inquiries into the institutional frameworks and policy enactment processes that explain the different effects of SAWA policies at the school level. In this sense, our main research question was how, why, under what circumstances, and for whom do SAWA policies work. More specifically, the reform project aimed first to analyze PBA as a policy instrument that generates a broad range of responses among school actors, and second, to examine how these responses are contingent to different school characteristics and subjective variables. So, in short, we aimed to unpack the black box of policy implementation and to explore the mediating role of a school context in policy enactment. To do so, we tried to combine realist evaluation principles with policy enactment and sense-making theory. And what is interesting here, as Gerard explained yesterday, is that we add another dimension to these theories, that is the role of performance pressure. I mean, how the relationship between, on the one hand, teachers' beliefs, and on the other hand, performance perceived pressure affect teachers and school responses and translations. So here you can see a figure which represents the program ontology of SAWA policies, and I would say that this theory of change has also influenced the design of the instruments that we used for data collection purposes. So, well, now I'm going to talk very shortly about the qualitative instruments, specifically about the principals and teachers interview scripts. Both of them, as you can see here, follow the same structure. I mean, we organized the questions in the following thematic blocks, which include the biographical information of the participant, a school, the role of a school and a school context, TBA pressures, data use and responses, and then a range of questions about administrative accountability and market accountability. Regarding the data analysis, we combined an inductive and deductive approach, which followed three main steps or phases. First, we conducted a direct qualitative content analysis, and to do so, we first developed a code book iteratively based on the theory, the themes included in the interview script, and the research questions. And second, we coded all the interview transcriptions, combining these deductive and inductive codes that covered the main key themes of the research. And finally, we grouped all the codes in different families of codes that are the following: the biographical information, the school context, the school culture, policy interpretation, policy translation, perceived pressure and expectations, satisfaction and autonomy, and innovation discourse and practice. In this sense, it is interesting, or it is important to note that although this, or especially the first 7 groups were like the shared groups that we used in all the countries, then depending on a specific, or depending on country-specific characteristics and interests, we also included different groups of codes, such as, for example, in the case of the satisfaction and autonomy, because in the case of the Netherlands, our colleague Nathalie Brouwis was very interested to go more in depth in the analysis of teachers' professionalism and teachers' role. So she included this group of codes. And then in the case of Catalonia, it is also very relevant, the discourse of innovation related to school autonomy and accountability. So we also included these codes. And well, here you can see an example of the structure that follows the code book. I mean, first we identify the group, then we added a code name, the code, and then the code description. And well, regarding the sampling strategy, as you have seen during the conference, what is particularly interesting from this project is this sequential mixed methods approach. And well, in this sense, to select the schools, it is important to note that we used the survey data, and sometimes, depending on the country, we combined the survey data with secondary data as well to select the schools. In this sense, we followed a purposive sampling strategy to select these schools. In total, as you can see, we conducted fieldwork in 76 schools, and in this number of schools, we conducted 93 semi-structured interviews with school leaders and a total of 132 semi-structured interviews with teachers. And well, here I've put this figure just to illustrate the logic that we followed for the sampling strategy. This is a figure that was elaborated by Gerard Ferrer, and here he carried out a cluster analysis and obtained these 4 quadrants, which are elaborated on the basis of the combination of 2 main dimensions. On the one hand, we used this perceived pressure, and on the other axis, we use the school's disposition towards PBA. So here we have 4 main scenarios, and then we selected these red points that are the schools included in the qualitative fieldwork, and these schools were selected based on a criteria that aimed to find like heterogeneity. I mean heterogeneity in terms of the socioeconomic status of the schools, but also in terms of their ownership and so on. And yeah, and here you can see how the sample of schools for the Chilean case looks like, and the main schools characteristics. And well, finally, to conclude, what have been the main challenges and limitations of our fieldwork, especially our qualitative fieldwork? Well, first of all, it is important to highlight that in some cases it has been difficult to recruit schools and teachers, and this was due to the fact that some principals were very concerned about their teachers' high workloads. So yeah, they were very worried and sometimes also reluctant to accept to participate in the study. Then another thing that we found was the difficulty associated to the access to private subsidized schools. These type of schools were much more reluctant to participate in our study than public schools. And then we also found some difficulties associated to external factors, and especially associated to political and health disruptions. For example, well, on the one hand, the well-known COVID crisis, and on the other hand, for example, in the case of Chile, but also in the Netherlands, when we were carrying out the field work, there were some teachers' strikes and protests and so on, and this, of course, also added some difficulties to conduct the field work. And then, as a positive thing, we have to say that compared with previous studies that we conducted, we also find much more easier to access those schools that have already participated in the survey. And well, I would say that more or less that's all from my side. I would like to point out as well that, well, then I have prepared the presentation of another methodological note that refers to the methodological note of the first research strand of the project that was elaborated by Clara Fondevila. This methodological note is available at the Reformed website, so we can look for it here. And well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anto and Luis. We were a bit pressured for time, but I think Luis made up for it. I would still suggest that in case you have a doubt or a clarifying question, we would do it afterwards, because I would like to now give the floor to Agnès for the closing ceremony. But Anto and Luis will be here afterwards, so you can ask them in case you have a question. I'm sorry about this, but I really want to leave enough time for Agnès. So for, just as a way of introduction, Agnès is a senior researcher at the Sciences Po Institute in Paris. I hope I pronounced it correctly. I was really practicing, but the floor is yours. I will prepare your presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you, Tony, and thank you to the Reform Research Project Group for inviting me for this closing presentation and this opportunity to share some of my ideas and some of my work, which has not been so much related to accountability questions these later years, although I'm still very much interested in public policy reform. But I'm going to focus more on how to analyze market actors and just take an example from my recent research to show the kind of things I have been showing in my work. And two of the principles I would like to emphasize is that in my own work, I consider that the sociology of education should not be isolated from other areas of sociology. So I take into account other sociological approaches that have been developed outside education. And also my guiding preoccupation in my work, which is both social and scientific, has been on social inequalities. So I always try to relate my work on policy, market actors, or whatever other areas I have worked, to their concrete effects on social inequalities. This I do because I do very qualitative work, so I'm really interested in how concrete actors engage with reforms, with what is going on. So I hope I can show it in this very short presentation. So in order to summarize, it's an easy way of summarizing it. It's not totally true. I will say that I have tried to combine in my research for perhaps the last 15 years a Bourdieusian approach focusing on dispositions and a more, let's say, economic sociology, cultural sociology approach focusing on dispositif and how these two can be combined and take what I think is the best from this very different and contrasting theoretical perspective. And I will be happy to come back to the difficulties of combining this, because I don't think I have found perfect solution of doing this, but I still think it has been very rewarding theoretically and empirically. So in my Bourdieusian perspective, I'm not going to develop this because I suppose many of these are familiar with this perspective. I take into account this multidimensional view of social space, focusing on groups and individuals, different types of capital. I have tried to bring my own very small contribution to this grand theory by focusing on different types of cultural capital, because I think the notion of capital is too general and we have to take into account. So in my previous work on school choice, I focus on two different groups in France, which Bourdieu already focused on, which was this intellectual fraction and this economic fraction of the upper class. But I try to show that the difference between them is not only about the levels of economic capital and cultural capital, but also that the cultural capital of the economic fraction is partly a technocratic capital and a managerial type of cultural capital, because the economic fraction of the upper class in France has a lot of cultural capital. But the question is that it is not exactly the same type of cultural capital. And this has related to what I'm going to say later on. So a focus on actors' disposition, linked to early socialization in specific social contexts, and how these resources and dispositions influence actors' capacity and willingness to engage with dominant regimes. Regime is not a word that Bourdieu used, so I'm interested in using, sorry, I just jumped. Using this model by Phil Brown in one of his articles in 2000 on positional competition, he distinguishes these three different regimes. He hasn't been working more on this later on, but I still think this is very valuable to the kind of work I do. So I distinguish these three types of regimes: membership, meritocracy, and market. So in membership, which are regimes of inclusion and exclusion, in membership, there is this direct transmission of advantage based on ascription and ties with social collectivities. Well, I mostly focus on social classes, but of course we can take ethnic, racial, religious, gender, etc. Meritocracy, of course, we're very familiar with, which is the transmission or earning of advantage based on individual merit, frequently scholastic, especially in France, and conceived as a combination of talent and effort. And now I'm going to focus more on the market regime, which is based on this also individualistic indirect transmission or earning of advantage through financial means and adaptation to market values. And I use it in singular and plural because economists tend to talk about market value and sociology of market values, and I think it's worthwhile to combine both. And what I just want to emphasize is that it is not that each regime replaces the other, it's that each regime combines with the other. So when Bourdieu was writing in the 1960s and 1970s, he was focusing only on the combination of membership and meritocracy. The main thesis of reproduction, as you are probably very well aware of, is that true meritocracy doesn't exist because it has been colonized by membership. But he did not say that much about market. There are some reflections about markets in The State Nobility, which is a later book, but it's not so much the focus of his research, and I have been trying to say, what can we do with capitals and dispositions in a market regime which has not replaced meritocracy and membership, but combines with it. So, I also use this typology by Phil Brown in the same article, which is called these two types of exerting influence on market regimes or in market regimes, which is what it calls rigging, which is how do you control the rules of the market. So they are the powerful actors, the state, but also the powerful groups and organizations influencing the decisions. So this is action on the market. And ranking, which is action in the market, so how actors use resources in market competition. So I have tried to use this kind of Bourdieusian Bavarian framework from Bourdieu and Phil Brown with concepts from cultural and economic sociology. So I use some of the work in cultural sociology, which focuses on worth, valuation, and evaluation. So especially Michelle Lamont's work on hierarchies and grammars of worth and types of evaluation, especially that she has applied that in some areas related to research and education. And also all the work that has been developed on quantitative and qualitative evaluation tools outside education and in education as well. And I'm also interested in some of the work on the market. I came across this because I was unhappy with some of the work on markets in education which only focus on this, either the positional value in markets, which is I myself did that in my own research, talking about status markets, so how the capability to position its owner with a space of a differentiated social world, and especially I use the work by an economic sociologist, Joel Podolny, where it talks about status leaking from products and services to consumers and vice versa, and I have used that in my research on elite education. So how elite schools look for elite students, and elite students look for elite schools, so there is this exchange of status between the two. But in my recent work that I'm going to present very briefly today, I've also been interested in imaginative value, what Becker calls imaginative value, and is how the market sells imagined states to the people. And I think we have to connect with that, and it has to do with presented scenarios about the future, connection with other spaces, relation to other people. I hope this will become clear when I'm going to talk about taking an example. In France, we have a very lively economic sociology, which is very well known in other countries as well. So I have tried to use these strands as well. So I have been using some of the work of Frank Cochoy, who has one of the specialists of marketing and packaging devices, which I think are very important in educational markets. Also, Lucien Carpic has done work on what he calls judgment devices, such as rankings and guides, not necessarily in education, but in other areas as well, used to equip the consumer and facilitate and channel his or her choices, and also the work of Michel Calon and people working with him around what he calls calculative devices used to economize and facilitate decisions. This overlap, and it's not very easy sometimes to say, well, are we talking about a packaging device or a judgment device, calculative device? So now I'm going to move towards just very briefly how market actors intervene in the French context. I'm, of course, very aware doing qualitative work of how important context is. And the French context is particular. And, of course, what I say cannot directly apply necessarily to other contexts. But, of course, there are similarities between France and other countries. A key element is to understand that as opposed to England, for instance, in France, the introduction and legitimation of market actors has been very discreet, almost hidden, and this is consensual among all work conducted by political scientists, people working in the economy, that this is the way the market has been introduced, and even more so that, in fact, market actors have been first introduced by the socialist government in the 1980s after the first economic crisis. So in education in particular, for instance, this introduction of market actors was not made by claiming that the market was going to do better. This is not a claim in France that is never made, not even by the more liberal of our governments. So it's frequently in a very hidden way. So at the beginning, it was this idea of developing, changing bureaucratic modes of governance by liberating the local initiative, fostering participation at the local level. But more and more, this introduction of the market actors has been linked to financial shortages, the lack of reactivity and lack of competence of state administration and professionals, and also to circumventing resistance from educational professionals and the unions. So the market actors are aware that they cannot just come and say, well, we are here, we are going to do better. So what they have been doing is seizing all the opportunities created by policy decisions or non-decisions. I consider that non-decisions are as important as decisions. So looking for the public state officials have been looking for models to improve the performance of the public school system. You are all very much aware about new public management, so how to improve the performance of the public school system by importing some elements from the private sector, also to increase the reactivity of public actors, and also, and I consider this very important, is that market actors have also intervened to increase the visibility of results. They're specialists in the marketing and packaging, and that's very important. Also, the fact that some of the policies have created new spaces for the intervention of private actors because the public actors have not been involved, either because they did not have resources or because they did not have the competence or the time or because they were resisting the policy, and because a lot of money has been directly or indirectly provided for private actors. And many private actors also claim they are fulfilling a public service. This is, of course, the case of private schools, which in generally say we are here fulfilling a public service, but it's also the case of many other private actors that say we are not public actors, but we are taking the role of a public service. And finally, market actors have been intervening, did I jump? No. Intervening at a more powerful level with a shadow influence in have been invited to committees, participation to reports on the state of the educational system, a lot of lobbying that is not visible from the outside. And also in the French context, what we see is that frequently market actors operate behind actors which are voluntary or non-totally market actors. So they operate behind foundations, think tanks that receive public and private money, or regional and municipal actors, or powerful higher education private institutions, or agencies from the voluntary sector. So, in fact, their action is not always very visible, as it is not claimed as a kind of market action. And I think researchers have contributed to this as well, because many researchers do not want to work on market actors. And one of the things is that it's not very easy to work on market actors. They are not very compliant. They are not very open to researchers. Many times they have opposed to my research. Well, these are data with commercial value, so we're not going to give it to you. Or also, many researchers think that you will be complicit with market actors if you work on them. The same happened to me when I was working on elites. So I have been defending myself that I'm not promoting the elites and I'm not promoting the market actors. So I think also the fact that there is not so much research on these actors is a problem as well. So I'm going to take this example, which is perhaps a little displaced from your main research interest, which I know in the conference are around mostly primary and secondary education. But higher education is a very good example to test these theories first, because there is big investment at the moment in access to higher education in developed economies, because I mean the 19th century was the century of primary education, 20th century secondary education, and now we are moving into the century of higher education, not necessarily universal higher education, but improving participation to higher education. Also, it is a sector where the state does not claim that it can do everything, and there is acceptance that perhaps the state cannot do everything in higher education. And we have a lot of powerful actors, vested interest, and much more relation to employers, because we're very close to students getting into work. So for many reasons, it's a very interesting sector to analyze this market actors' response. So these are some of the policy discourses and decisions in the French context that have opened the way, paved the way to the introduction of the market actors. So first, a growing emphasis on increasing access to higher education, emphasizing students' freedom to, but also responsibility for, imagining more ambitious higher education futures. At the same time that this is the dominant discourse, there was a reduction rather than increase in the number of guidance counselors. In fact, the government, different types of government, have decided that they are going to eliminate the group of guidance counselors. And they have put a strong pressure on teachers to take in charge new guidance activity for higher education. But teachers have really resisted this. This has met with strong reluctance from teachers. There has been no financial incentive, no training for teachers, just additional hours given to teachers for guidance. A new policy in 2008 of widening participation, which was entitled Team for Success. A creation in 2009 of a national higher education admission platform, which was changed in 2018, and new competencies given to regions in 2018 concerning information. This is typical of the French system, how it works, so that there is a distribution of competencies which looks very rational in paper, but is totally irrational in practice. So in fact, the regions have the power of giving information on higher education to students, and the schools and the teachers give guidance, as if information and guidance could operate as different sectors. So this has paved the way to the massive introduction of market actors. A main change has been the increase in the number of private higher education institutions. One of the characteristics of the French higher education system was the very limited presence of private institutions compared to other countries. It has been a state sector. So for a long time, up to the early 2000s, there were 7% of students in private higher education institutions. Well, now it's 20%. So there has been an increase, very large increase in the percentage of students now going to the private sector. This private sector has created a new competition for low prestige, low quality higher education. Many of you are familiar with this because in many other countries, I know about Latin America, like in Brazil or in Chile, etc. This has existed for a long time, that you have this low prestige, low quality private sector in higher education, but this is totally new in the French landscape. And this has gone along with the flourishing of many of the market devices. So one of the market devices I have studied in detail in my research. So we studied 25 higher education fairs in Paris with my research team, doing a lot of observations and interviews in the fairs. Not getting a lot of data on the fairs because the commercial value of the data on students, which is sold to many other private enterprises. So that's how higher education, their commercial model, is that they get addresses from students that they sell to other actors, and so they don't want to give any kind of information about who goes to the fairs. So we don't have, unfortunately, the data on that. So these fairs are organized by a growing number of private agencies. Initially, it was agencies specializing in counseling, but now many media groups, many of the main journals like Le Figaro, Le Monde, they have their own fairs. And what is particular about the fairs is if you don't know anything about the French higher education system and you go to a fair in Paris, 80% of the higher education institutions that are there are private. So you will think that this is a whole private sector. So the landscape that is presented does not correspond to reality. And we have been very interested in the kind of discourse that is presented to the students in the fairs. And I go back to what I say about the imaginative value of markets, which I think is important. There is no imagination in schools. For a long time, teachers only told to lower class students what they could not do. Today, they are not doing that because we have changed. Now they are not saying anything because they don't think that they have the right to because students have to go to higher education, but still they don't have any kind of positive discourse or what lower class students can do in higher education. So these lower class students go to the fairs, and what they hear is everything is wonderful. That's the market. It's like you are in Disney World. So when you are there, everything is possible. Don't say that your grades are going to forbid you to go into this or that. Money is not an obstacle. Of course, we have all these plans that you can use to pay for your education, etc. The higher education experience is a dream-like experience. So you will travel all the time. There are parties all the time, etc. And your professional futures are wonderful as well. So you will work only in creative jobs, well-paid, internationally oriented jobs, etc. So this is the market as we know it in other areas, but which is replaced in education. The techniques are the usual techniques, so all the visual, audio techniques. The lower the status of the institution, the more techniques are used to present it, so visual, audio, etc. And a lot of goodies that are given to the students, so all the students love that they get a lot of different presents in the stands, and wonderful narratives from other students in the institutions. So I have talked to the students myself, my students have talked to them, so many of their narratives do not give an objective view of what goes on in the institution, but again, everything is wonderful. And these fairs present themselves as neutral and providing a public service because they organize conferences in the fair to provide guidance for the students. For instance, the title of a conference will be, what can you do if you have a technological baccalaureate? So that will be the title of the conference. And they present themselves as neutral judgment devices, and they say, because the schools are not doing their jobs, we are doing the job in the fair. The problem is that the people who are talking in the fairs, the invited people in the fairs, are all representative from these private higher education institutions. So the type of discourse they're given is very channeled in different ways. And so what we have observed is that schools use the fairs very differently according to their status. So especially in the lower class schools, they delegate a lot of their jobs of sending the students to the fairs, because teachers do not want to get involved. They tell the students to go to the fair, and they don't even do work with the students after they have gone to the fairs. So they delegate really the work to the fairs. And also, we have documented very carefully what students do in the fair, and especially the lower class students, they see it as a play activity. Is free because the commercial model of the fair is not based on the consumers paying, but differently. So the students go there on a Sunday afternoon. They get a lot of goodies. They go around, etc. So it's very playful. And they really play on impression management. Many of these students do not know how to distinguish the marketing from the reality of what's going on, and so they get very much involved into this. We did similar work, and I'm not to be too long, also working on the internet, and a similar question arises. We did an exercise with students on the internet, so they had to get information on the internet about their project for higher education. And what we see is that many agencies and also all these higher education institutions are presenting themselves in the internet, using the same marketing and packaging techniques. And students from the lower classes, it's their main source of information is the internet. They use the internet alone, not with their parents. The teachers do not teach them how to critically analyze the information on the internet, so they take the discourse at the face value. We also have done a lot of work on the national platform, which is a calculative dispositif, to use it, the Calonne's concept, and relies on the idea of a strategic consumer. For instance, the first platform, which was called Admission Post-Bac, students had to rank their preferences, so they had to be very strategic about the selection mechanism of higher education institutions. Of course, the lower class students do not know about this selection mechanism, so the ranking looked totally irrational from the perspective of the rational consumer. The second platform has eliminated the ranking, but has asked students to sell themselves in personal statements. So it has introduced another market feature. So the last thing I wanted to say about this example of higher education is also the work I have been doing also for a long time on widening participation. And here what we see, just to make it short, is that a lot of these policies, which were initiated by prestigious higher education institutions, now have been extended by the state through this policy Team for Success to all higher education institutions. And in fact, there has been a lot of money put into that. And this has become like the leading policy to fight inequalities, which is terrible because it has like no effect on diminishing inequalities. And in addition to that, it has given a lot of money to private firms that are more and more present in these schemes. Many business professionals lead special sessions about the world of work, preparing for disadvantaged students for them, teaching them the social codes. And this has been facilitated by regional authorities that have given a lot of room to these actors, and also because they have come with foundations and associations involved. So just to conclude very briefly, what I have tried to say is that many public policy decisions, I took this example of higher education because of my recent work on this and because I could document it carefully, but I could have taken many other examples. I analyzed these effects previously on school markets in secondary education. We can also do the same type of analysis of what's going on in teacher training with the introduction of private actors as well. And I could take other sectors of education. And what we see is that on the one hand, this promotion of a market regime and market actors have favored the consolidation of an economic and managerial elite who has widely now replaced the previous cultural and technocratic elite with a lot of political, economic, and social implications. So my new research that I'm conducting is on the production of this new economic elite. I was, for instance, reading an interesting article 3 days ago, in Le Monde, which said that the fact that this new managerial elite had replaced the previous technocratic elite in France, where engineers or people trained in political science, the cultural elite as well, has diminished by 6% the salary of workers. So they have documented that very carefully in France and in Denmark as well, and showing that, in fact, because all the leading ideology is for profit, so just the replacement of one elite by another has a lot of impact, not just on workers' salaries, but in many other areas as well. They have replaced the ideals associated with public service that should not be idealized, because as we know, many of these meritocratic ideal was colonized by membership, so it was not an ideal system. And I'm not necessarily nostalgic about how the previous system worked, but of course this new market regime has introduced other ideals. And as I said, I'm mostly interested in what's the impact of this on inequalities, on especially how this impact on the lower classes. So in fact, what we see now is that the lower classes, they accumulate all the disadvantages of, they don't have the right ascribed attitudes and ties of the membership regimes. So they don't belong to the right social class, they don't have the good racial attributes, etc. They lack the expressions of talent and their efforts are ineffective in the meritocratic regime. So they were already penalized by membership, meritocracy, and now they lack the economic resources and the cultural resources necessary to behave strategically in the market regime. So in fact, what I'm trying to say is that there is an accumulation of the different elements involved in each regime that disadvantage the most disadvantaged. Of course, this is true at a group level, and in another piece of research I have been conducted focusing on diversity, we see that to some extent some diversity policies try to reward some individuals from the lower classes where the racial attributes, for instance, are valued, because we need some black representatives in the French political system, which is mostly male and white until today. Also, merit has been transformed in such a way that they can participate in meritocracy in the way, for instance, they are considered in admission. And also, some of them are rewarded because they can display some market adaptability. We have been seeing that in some, for instance, students from immigrant groups that manage to display this market adaptability and move up to the top. But this, of course, is a very limited number of individuals, and it doesn't, of course, change the situation of the lower class group more generally. So I just wanted to share some of these thoughts with you. I hope this is not very far away from your central interest, and I'm happy to respond to your remarks or questions.
Thank you so much, Agnès, for this very interesting final closing talk. Since we started a little bit later, we have a little bit of time in case there are any questions. We can do one round of questions. If there are any questions.
Or remarks.
Or criticism or remarks or doubts.
Everyone is looking for having a drink, I think.
In this case, I will give the floor to Tony now, who has some final words.
About what you said, having a beer in the hands. Well, where's my keynote? I have... No. Don't worry, guys. It has been very busy 3 days, and I only will conclude with some acknowledgements that I think are very, very important, because I think it's very important to say thanks to the organizing committee, because we are not professionals of this type of organization, and it has been, a lot of everyday logistics, but with a fantastic group of people. Some of them are not in the program, and I think it's important to mention them, starting with Nuria Torres and Oscar Ruiz, but also Lluís Parcerisa, Clara Fondevila, Mauro Moschetti, and Edgar Quilabert, who is the boss of it all. So, thank you so much. So many of them have been part of the scientific committee of this conference, together with Antonina Levatino, Gerard Ferrer-Esteban, Giulia Montefiore, Laura Mentini, Marcel Pagès, Marjolaine Kamphausen, Nathalie Braus, and Andreu Termes. We also had the special support these 2 days from Omaima El Gopotsi and Marina Lopez Levy, sitting here. Thank you as well. I am not going to repeat the names of the amazing group of keynote speakers and participants in the roundtable of today, but thank you for their thorough input during these days that have animated a lot, I think, the discussion and the work of the networks. So a special mention as well to the associated partners of the project that made their way to Barcelona, starting with Guri Esquesmo, Miriam Prieto, also sitting here, Alejandra Falabella, Dalila Andrade, and Juliana Souza. Thanks to the people of the Casal Orlandai, because they have created a very nice environment for us to have this discussion in a very friendly atmosphere, which demonstrates that space matters. And, well, I think that many of you are congratulating us for the methodology, but I think that this methodology has worked, it was a bit of an experiment, has worked because of you, your active engagement and your patience, because it has been a program of 3 very busy days. So thank you for making this event possible. And now I am happy to say that, it's beer time. Thank you so much.